Thank you, Farokh, and thank you to the Khaki Tours team for inviting me to do this talk. I presume that everyone can see my screen now.
Yes, we can.
I see some familiar faces in the Zoom sort of chat room. I hope that this talk won't be sort of boring for some of you because I may be repeating some of the material once again. But I'll try to improvise and maybe say a few new things that you possibly have not heard of before. So the journey of the book began in 2009. Some of you have seen this image already. It's when I was doing my MA at the University of Copenhagen. I was doing performance studies then, which is actually fairly different from what I've ended up doing now. So I was learning how to do theater, whether that was voice training or commedia dell'arte or direction, that was sort of the path that I thought I was on. This is an image of us meeting Barrio 4, which was, I think, a fairly important moment for all of us. But there was something else that happened during that time that in many ways changed the course of my life. And that was finding a book in the University of Copenhagen library called The Parsi Theatre, Its Origins and Development by Somnath Gupta, edited by Catherine Hansen. I was very intrigued by this thing that I'd never heard of before called Parsi theatre. I thought, as most of us do, that Parsi theatre is Adi Marzban and Dorab Mehta. And so I started thumbing through the pages of that book, and I was shocked to find out that there was this thing in the 19th century that was the precursor to Bollywood and the Indian cinema industry, and proscenium-based theatre in Burma and Singapore and Malaysia. And that had been so hugely influential, but for some reason I had never heard of it before. So I decided one of the things that I would do after finishing my master's program was maybe to see if I could find any primary sources in India related to the Parsi theatre, because one thing that the book lacked, for lack of a better word, was references to primary sources. It was very anecdotal. So there was, very sort of abstract information on this 120-year-old cultural phenomenon. There was no sense of what was happening when, or which people were performing when, or which actor belonged to which troupe. And so, the search for primary sources was what I sort of took off on in 2010. I did what all self-respecting scholars do, which is I went to Google and I typed Parsi theatre scripts. And the first thing that came up at the time was the archives of UNESCO Parzor Foundation in Delhi. Dr. Shehnaz Kama had 100 scripts that belonged originally to the Calcutta Parsi Amateur Dramatics Club. That is, the oldest amateur dramatics club in South Asia, if not one of the oldest in the world. And they had this incredible corpus of Parsi theatre scripts that, they were essentially performing many of the scripts that were performed in Bombay. So they would request J.F. Madan or some of the companies in Bombay, the Khatau company, to send scripts to them. So they managed to amass this incredible corpus of Parsi theatre material over the years through sort of their links to the commercial Parsi theatre. In fact, if you go to the old premises of the Parsi Amateur Dramatics Club in Calcutta, you can still see images of Jahangir Khatau from 1930. And Khatau was one of the most important actor managers of the Parsi theatre. So Parzor was one key sort of place, but at the time I couldn't read Gujarati. I knew Gujarati, like any sort of half Parsi or Parsi child growing up in Bombay in the 90s, I knew the language, but I didn't know how to read it. And so I began essentially learning how to read the language with the help of my mother, who would read the lines of the script, essentially perform the scripts for me, and I would record her voice and then read along with her, and that was how I learned the language. Then I thought, well, the easiest way to actually start doing this project properly is through a PhD. I didn't have plans up until then to do a PhD, but it just seemed like the logical route in order to be able to buy the time to be able to do this work properly. So that's what I did. I ended up at the University of Munich, and that's where a dear, dear professor friend of mine, at the time, not so dear, because he was giving me very advice that I didn't want to hear, but that again, set the course of my life in very influential ways. He said, you know, you haven't even begun doing the archival research. You need to go back to Bombay and see what newspapers you can find, because there must be information in the newspapers, in the vernacular newspapers about Parsi theatre. And maybe it was a blessing that the University of Munich did not have a digitized subscription to the Times of India. I think, you know, a lot of the research that you find today is somewhat sloppy because you can just put in a term in the ProQuest search engine and then develop a whole sort of thesis on a particular topic. And that kind of work does not allow you to say, look at a particular cultural phenomenon, but also everything happening around it during that time. And that was what I was able to do at sort of the second archive that I went to, which is the J.N. Pettit, which is an incredibly place that's very dear to me in many ways. I spent many months sitting in the reading room on the first floor with many of the old Parsi men who come there to drink their tea and congregate, and flipping page after page of the Rast Goftar from 1855 to the early 20th century. And that was an incredible intellectual exercise because, like I said, it allowed me to see what was happening in the Parsi theatre at a very sort of minuscule level, but also to contextualize that with everything that was happening around the Parsi theatre, not just in India and abroad, but also for the Parsis of Bombay. You know, whether they were debates about conversion or about Parsi laws or about, you know, a famous case of two girls committing suicide from the Raja Bhai Tower. You know, I was able to sort of see essentially a narrative in terms of how the theatre was developing. And the third important archive, was the K.R. Kama Oriental Institute. They have an incredible corpus of information on sort of on 19th century Parsis, including this seminal text, Parsi Natak Taktani Tavarik, which has the only images of Parsi theatre actors and managers. And so that was also a hugely important repository in my work. But these are the material archives for the PhD. And I would say that more than the material archives, the personal archives have been fairly pivotal in terms of the writing of this book. So, you know, already at the Parzor Institute, Dr. Kama had the autobiography of Jahangir Khambata. And then when I returned to Bombay, who's a very famous actor manager, when I returned to Bombay, I met the descendants of the Khambata family who live in Bandra. And they were able to give me all the materials that they had left. They'd thrown a lot away, but they had still some incredible images of Khambata as a sailor, you know, with his friends, as a young boy, his playbills. And you also then, I was then able to also get a sense of family history and how these Parsi theatre families had essentially made the shift from 19th century popular touring entertainment to something else. That was also especially evident with the Khadao families. So I met many of the descendants of Kawasji and Jahangir Khadao in Bandra and in Tardeo. And again, they were able to give me a sense of how the fortunes of the Khadao family had changed over the years, how sort of from Kawasji Khadao being the pinnacle really of wealth in the 19th century, things had dramatically shifted over the years for the sons and the grandsons, which in a way is also a metaphor of the Parsi community and a certain narrative of decline. And then finally, I met the descendants of the Kabraji families. And of course, I guess it had to be this way. Bamanji Kabraji's grandson, and he lived in the same building that I grew up in Colaba. So, it was beautiful and ironic, but also not ironic that he would just be, a few minutes away from where I grew up. And so that sort of very strong sense of the local very much inflected the work. Just people talking about their memories of their grandmothers and their grandparents and their great-grandparents, I think fundamentally shifted the tone, I think, of the work in many ways. My own personal experiences as well feed into the book in ways that may not be overtly perceptible. I went through big personal changes as I was writing the book. So I got married and to a non-Parsi, and just the simple act, say, of having to get married with the Parsi ceremony in a private premises rather than in public, these things were sort of somewhere at the back of my mind, as also the conversations that many of these men at the J.N. Pettit Institute were having around me while I was flipping pages of the J.N. Pettit, whether that was about rising rents or squabbles with neighbors belonging to other religious communities. These things inevitably inflected what I was looking for in the archival material, but also how I was reading. And so the book, I would say, many people ask me who the audience of the book is. In fact, that was the first question that I received from my editor, because it wasn't clear to her that the book was written for an academic audience. In fact, the first draft very much was not written keeping in mind an academic audience. The first draft, if I have to be very honest with myself, thinking retrospectively now about what I was doing 2-3 years ago, or 5 years ago, actually, the first draft, it was written keeping in mind the Parsi community of Bombay as the primary readership. And that becomes obvious when you read the book from back to front rather than from front to back. So, if you see the last chapters, they're all about ideas of race, eugenics, purity of blood, Aryanism, Darwinism, and you can see subsequently how these ideas sort of evolved over the course of the 19th century, whether that was through meetings with Max Muller or the Marriage and Divorce Act of 1865. In a sense, many of the ideas that many other groups and communities have grappled with have not been grappled with by the Parsis of Bombay yet. And in that sense, the book makes an intervention, even if it does so very subtly, by talking about how many of the ideas that we take for granted today about, purity of race or the numbers declining. They're very much modern ideas, and they stem from a particular place and time. So having said that, having laid out the background of the book, I'll go into an overview of the actual thing. I don't know if I need to say this, but I will, just in case there are people in the room that don't know who the Parsis are. Ethno-religious minority that fled for the coast of Gujarat between the 8th and 10th century, remained on the periphery of Gujarat, as we know, for approximately 1,000 years, until the Portuguese and the British arrived in Western India. And that's when they made a swift occupational shift from agriculture and artisanry to international trade and shipping. And they joined existing European firms, becoming indispensable in occupations such as brokerage, banking, and shipbuilding. And a core thesis of the book is the idea of the comprador, which is a Portuguese word for middlemen. We know from existing literature on compradors, which, even this literature has changed in many ways. We've gone from Frantz Fanon, who condemns compradors for being hand in glove with the British, to developing a somewhat more nuanced view, I think, of who compradors were and what they did. And compradors were essentially the people that made possible the British Empire. They allowed the British to sort of manage their trade in these foreign, strange outposts that the British had essentially no clue about. So whether it was language and translation, or dealing with local communities through recruitment and managing work, this was essentially the labor undertaken by the comprador. And you see the heritage, the long lineage of the Parsis in compradorial work through surnames, whether it's Dalal, which means broker, or Dubash, which means two languages or translator, but also in my case, Nicholson. A lot of Parsis today like to say that their surnames, maybe they had some British ancestry, but the real painful truth, or I shouldn't say painful, but the truth is that, it was they were essentially names that were taken from the firms that Parsis used to work for. So yes, I would say that the compradorial role of the Parsis was hugely important in their development, but also in their sort of rise to success. So if we think about all of the embellishments in South Bombay today, if we think about the schools, the Parsi schools, or the fountains, or the Bombay University, even though that was not made by a Parsi, or if you think of the hospitals, all of that essentially stemmed from compradorial wealth because of the Parsis' engagement in the cotton and opium trade. Well, so the first phase of the book, which is, I would say, the most heavy, that's where the book reads, it has very strong academic, very strong academic tone is part one, where I talk about the birth of the public sphere in Bombay, which can be traced to the origins of the Bombay Samachar in the 1820s. Initially, the Bombay Samachar was not a newspaper. It was simply a way for the Parsis to get market rates quickly, more faster than government postage. But then a very naughty missionary, John Wilson, decides to attack the Parsis for their religion for the first time in the Bombay Samachar. And the editor was he was completely ill-equipped to deal with Wilson, who was writing in Gujarati and attacking the Parsis using references to scientific literature, telling them that the religion was polytheistic, that they worshipped the elements, that it was crude and uncivilized. And that essentially, it was a process where essentially the Parsis, their innermost beliefs were being dragged out and debated and contested in the public eye very publicly for the first time. And so this prompts the movement for social reform that I would say really takes off in the 1850s with the publication of the Rast Goftar, for example. So by 1855, because of sort of all of these heated debates that are taking place in the press between not just missionaries and religious communities, but then also within communities, the press grows to include 10 Gujarati, 3 Marathi, 1 Hindustani, and 1 Parsi newspaper. And the Rast Goftar, which was founded by Dadabhai Nauroji, was the primary organ for the Parsi social reform movement. So it's a hugely important resource, if not the most important resource in understanding the Parsi social reform movement. And so the Rast Goftar, along with other organizations like the Rahnumai Mazda Yasni Sabha, the Religious Reform Association, the Bombay Association, the Society for the Diffusion of Knowledge, which sort of like Khaki tours was organizing, or the K.R. Kama Institute was organizing talks in Bombay every week. All of these organizations essentially worked together to promote social reform. And so whether it was changing native superstitions, ridiculing Parsi women who were wailing at funerals, trying to make women not wear jewelry, excessive jewelry at weddings, dowries, all of these things were lambasted by the reformist press that was essentially trying to align, I would say, Parsi values and morals with civilized English ones, to put it quite crudely. But civilization, morality, and progress were terms that are terms that keep recurring in the volumes of the Rast Goftar during that period. And the Parsi theatre was part of this process, of the process of social reform. So on Saturday, the 29th of October, 1853, a Parsi theatrical committee comprising the city's leading reformists, Dadabhai Nauroji being one of them again, announced the performance at the Grant Road Theatre of a play entitled Rustam, Zabuli and Sohrab, along with the local farce, Dhanji Garak. The book talks about what these plays were about, how Rustam, Zabuli, and Sohrab was essentially a way of developing a narrative of Persian history that was essentially demythologized. The book also talks about how Dhanji Garak is essentially, it's a fascinating farce because it's a farce set in a courtroom, which functions as an interesting parallel for the public sphere, and how the public sphere was also functioning in a way as a kind of informal courtroom. And the play is all about how Dhanji, he's a watchmaker who steals people's, he doesn't steal people's watches, but he puts snuff in it. And then he says, look, the watch is bad. And then he just swallows the watches. So the play is about bringing sort of his clients to justice. It's comic, it's funny, but it's also quite punitive in the sense that there was a real Dhanji that was doing this in Bombay. And this was what the Parsi theatre was essentially doing. It was an extra legal apparatus that was showing the Parsis visually what was wrong with their community and how they needed to reform certain things. So whether it was, again, the dowries, the evils of dowry, the evils of child marriage, or there's another famous one, which I can't now think of, but, essentially all evil customs were essentially shown on the Parsi stage. And that was how the Parsis attempted to promote social reform visually. Bejan Surti was about teachers, indigenous teachers, and sort of pre-British forms of learning that were criticized. Bal Vivah about child marriage. They all played on themes that were elaborated on in the press. And so from the beginning, as I mentioned, the Parsi theatre functioned as part of this much larger disciplinary network comprising the school, press, and courtroom, which was all about bringing the Parsi community onto the road of morality and virtue and civilization and progress. Predictably, even as we can take the example even of today, there was considerable traditionalist reaction to the Parsi theatre and the ideals that it was trying to promote. So the Jame Jamshed particularly, and was extremely critical of the Parsi theatre and accused the thespians as being destructive, and critically their farcical and very deceitful portrayal of the community before an audience of Englishmen. A very good example of this is The Marriage of Nader Shah, which is essentially about child marriage. So the play depicts this old man, Nader Shah, who gets his son. He's looking for a wife for his son. And without seeing the bride, he marries his son off because of a very large dowry. But then in the end, it's discovered that the wife is blind. So, Nader Shah repents his foolishness. It's a horrible play if you think about it. But at the time, there was enormous criticism of this particular play because there were Englishmen in the audience, and subsequently the newspapers in Bombay, the English newspapers in Bombay, were writing reviews of the play, talking about how the Parsis need to reform this evil custom. So the traditionalists were considerably aggravated by the Parsi theatre, and they thought that these thespians were trying to make a quick buck with these plays. And because of this criticism that the Parsi theatre inevitably found itself at the center of, the Parsi theatre had to change. It had to essentially adopt a kind of self-defensive strategy. And so the criticisms resulted in 4 key transformations. The first is that the Parsi theatre became transformed into a sign of colonial loyalty through the performances of Shakespeare that I'll get into in a bit. The Parsi theatre also eventually became a site for the modernization and emancipation of Indian women. So Indian women would take, I would say, center stage in many of the Parsi theatre performances. It would also become a marker of prestige and self-representation. You see this especially prior to the share crash of 1865. And finally, it became, and I think this is the most interesting bit, it became a locus for disciplining the body, for people's bodies. So I'll go briefly through each of the phases. In 1857, so this very, very important year of the rebellion, the Taming of the Shrew is performed on the Parsi stage just before the rebellion. There's a lot of literature in South Asian studies on how, performances of Shakespeare in the colonial context essentially functioned as a conciliating blueprint for the colonized. It was a way for Indians to adopt ideals of morality and progress. And so in many ways, Shakespeare was more effective in consolidating British rule than, say, military strength. But Shakespeare also, the book shows, served another very critical purpose. It's no coincidence that the first Shakespearean play performed is The Taming of the Shrew. And this play was subsequently performed only for Parsi women at the Grant Road Theatre on the 28th of April, 1857, by the Old Parsi Theatrical Company, 1858, sorry. And so the conception of the Parsi theatre, the view of the Parsi theatre as rational, moral, pedagogic amusement for the benefit of Parsi society, it not only facilitated its progressive acceptance by the majority of the community, including some traditionalists, but it also sanctioned the entry of women into public spaces. It allowed women to leave their homes and come to the theater for the first time with their husbands patiently waiting outside. After sort of this brief turn to Shakespeare, the Indian rebellion happens, and immediately after the rebellion, loyalty is the word that's on everyone's lips. You see it in the press through just an obsession, you know, things like the Parsis doing prayers for the benefit of the British and the rulers, and lots of commemorative events for the British, lots of denunciations in the Parsi press of the disloyal Indians that went against the benign British. But you also see then this culture of loyalty transforming. So you see that the Parsi Sethias, especially, because they're in a sense quite cornered because of the popularity of the reformist movement, for them, loyalty takes on a somewhat different form. And that's the beginning where you see the medal mania really taking off, where images of Parsis, you know, wearing medals all over them. They begin to quote acclaim and recognition, these Sethias, through large philanthropic projects, whether it's through buildings or creating fountains or hospitals, as I mentioned, but also in the theater, they begin to sponsor theater companies. And so you begin to see plays or performances with songs that praise Sethias, like the Gigi Boys, Bairamji Gigi Boy, for example. So this is sort of a bit of a funny phase where there's a lot of undue praising, I would say, of the Sethia community that's happening in the theater. Quite famously, there's a drop scene that one company paints with the bust of Gigi Boy right in the center. So there's a lot of essentially it was a 19th century form of advertising for the Sethias, the Parsi theater. But critically, in mid-March 1865, share prices, cotton share prices begin to drop because of the end of the American Civil War. As some of you may know, during the Civil War, cotton prices, there was a big cotton boom in Bombay because Indian cotton became hugely sought after. But at the end of the Civil War, all of this ends. And there's a massive, massive share crash, and hundreds of enormously wealthy Parsis, the millionaires of Bombay, they lose their wealth overnight. And you also begin to see scores of British commercial managers essentially running off and returning to England to sort of run away from calamities that they also caused very much. And so you see in the Parsi press the beginnings of a very interesting phenomenon, which is criticism of British commercial morality and virtue. It's the first time that you see the Rast Goftar really going out against the British and talking about lambasting these people who are running away and leaving the Indians in the lurch, and also pointing a finger at the Indians and saying that the Indians lack morality. And so the theater can no longer be kept in subordination to morality and virtue, because English morality and virtue has shown itself to be completely empty and a complete farce. And so this is where the phase of the body begins, and where the disciplining of the body takes center stage. And so the doctrine of Victorian civilization and progress is replaced by a certain masculine art of the body. And this is where I think interesting things start to happen. You see the birth of the Victoria Theatrical Company, which is the first professional company of the Parsi stage. And they begin to perform Iranian mythological plays like Bejan Ane Maneje and Rustam Ane Sohrab, written by the editor of the Rast Goftar, K. Khashru Kabraji. And they they do things like they perform Iranian marches and they sing Iranian patriotic songs. And there's a real sort of attempt at that's taking place at that point to find or to discover a more positivist narrative of the Parsi body and Parsi society. And so a performed body politic essentially begins to replace its penned legal equivalent for the conservation of social order and discipline. But you also see at this time, and for related reasons, a certain obsession with spectacle. So the image on the left, which is Austin Henry Layard's depiction of Sasanian Iran, that was used as a model for the Parsi theater's backdrop scenes. And you also see, again, an obsession with historical accuracy in costumes. So the Parsi theater playwrights would, study Orientalist literature to get a sense of how boots looked like, what did costumes look like, what did furniture look like in ancient Iran. That was really an attempt to sort of essentially recreate the glories, the lost glories of Persian society. And during this time, the Iranian theatrical company very much enters on stage. There were a lot of refugees coming from Iran at this time, Zoroastrian refugees. They did not speak Gujarati. And so they begin to perform plays in Farsi, in Persian, under the leadership of a very important director, Dadabhai Sorabji Patel, who I will subsequently talk about. But because they can't perform in Gujarati and because the audience, relies on a translator to understand the productions, spectacle becomes very important in their plays. So they would have real grass on stage, or they would bring, quite famously, they brought a real horse onto the stage, even though and again, there's a story behind that. Subsequently, someone who was jealous of the company, they sort of created a hole, a false hole in the stage, and the horse fell and injured the rider. But the Iranian theatrical company was hugely influential during this time. And so you see this combination of pride for the motherland Iran, singing and athletic sport and cycloramic views, and also magic lantern shows and dissolving views. All of this was essentially happening during this time on the Parsi stage. So you see this very clear shift now in the late 1860s from sort of quite simple plays for the Parsi community of Bombay, to these huge, spectacular plays that were accessible to people who could not understand the language, so the actual verbal text. And this is when the professionalization of the Parsi theater begins. So this attempt to create a trans-regional pan-Zoroastrian identity prompts the development of a pan-Asian, soon-to-be pan-Asian performance form, whose primary mode of communicative exchange was visual, as I mentioned, rather than verbal. So this is the phase where you begin to see plays like Dade Daryav, which includes the portrayal of a real ship on the stage, and actual waves that are created by the actors who are jumping up and down to create waves. And it also results in a meteoric rise in the theater's spectators, because the theater is no longer about civilizing the Parsi community. It's no longer pedagogical. It's now entertainment. And so patriotism becomes visual attractions. And you also begin to see in this phase unseen prophets, and also a new demographic of spectator. So on the one hand, you begin to see lots of children and sailors who come to the theater and pelt sort of tomatoes and bottles on stage and create a bit of a mess. But you also then see people of other communities, so Hindus, Muslims, Christians coming to the theatre. So no longer the Parsi theatre ceases to be solely for the Parsi community of Bombay. And so the public sphere transitions from a place where the Parsis can essentially debate their own customs and traditions to an intimate arena for play that overturns all sort of disciplinary mechanisms. And this is also when the Parsi theatre begins to tour, not uncoincidentally, first to within sort of the Bombay province and subsequently to Hyderabad and then to Delhi and Madras and eventually to Burma and then Singapore. And long-standing Parsi networks of trade very much facilitate this movement. You see this especially in the autobiography of Jahangir Khambata, where he talks about how some Parsi helped him, you know, in some obscure outpost with transferring the material from one train wagon to another. So the Parsis movement, the movement of the theatre was very much facilitated by the Parsis' long history in trade. Now I'm going to sort of run through this very quickly just because I'm acutely aware that I may be running out of time, but slowly there's a shift from spectacle and visuality. I mean, it's still there, the visuality, but you also then begin to see this really strange phenomenon of women, female characters taking center stage in the Parsi theatre's plays. The first play that does this is Sona Na Mulni Khorshid, which was the first Hindustani play of the Parsi stage performed by Dadabhai Sorabji Patel, the Victoria Theatrical Company. And in the play, you know, in descriptions of the play dating to the 19th century, they say that the play was done in Hindustani to attract a Muslim demographic to the theatre. And so this is the beginning where the Parsi community begins to feel alienated from so-called their theatre. You know, the play is quite weird. I think I might have mentioned this in another talk because it's all about this woman who's running away from men. So she first runs away from her rightful husband from her first husband to the second husband, who's her rightful husband. And then she's kidnapped by another man and she runs away from him. And at some point, there's a woman that falls in love with her, but she runs away from that woman. And in the end, she gets together with her rightful husband, which is the second husband. But the play is very interesting, even though it ostensibly makes no sense. If one considers post-colonial theory on how women, you know, the archetype of the female figure in the 19th century and how she functioned as a metaphor for the motherland. You know, the idea of this woman running away from the man always being the archetype for the colonizer, you know, starts to say, you know, the Parsi theatre essentially through these tropes starts to say very interesting things about the project of the British Empire. And so through Khorshid, whose chastity remains sort of untainted, the play essentially shows how, you know, Indian civilization has still sort of retained a certain kind of purity, even though the colonial state had tried to conquer its people. And this sort of trope of the woman in a few years' time becomes very charged and very, I would say, obvious in terms of them being an anti-colonial visual trope. So Khorshid becomes, you know, Damayanti. Khorshid becomes a Sita. So Hindu revivalism very much becomes a central occupation of the Parsi theatre. Lots of Hindu mythological plays begin to transpire in the late 1870s. So Kabraji makes a shift from writing Iranian mythological plays to Hindu mythological plays. He writes Nal Damayanti, for example. And dharma becomes a very important trope, again, in the Parsi theatre. This idea of a separate set of morals that are distinct from English morals of morality begins to take shape through the Parsi theatre on the Parsi stage. And so the theatre begins to articulate this very complex oppositional vocabulary between colonial and indigenous moral frames. And so within a few decades, you see this complete shift, this total sort of 180-degree shift where indigenous customs, you know, if they were previously being criticized, during the period of social reform in the 1860s. Now they were being valorized in the late 1870s and 1880s. So yes, and again, there's a lot of literature on how Hindu religious tropes were subsequently used by the Indian nationalist movement to articulate a populist anti-imperial politics. And many of these visuals, sort of the iconography of the sort of anti-colonial movement very much comes from and is developed or incubated in the Parsi theater, the popular Parsi theater. But at the same time, the Parsis aren't keeping quiet. I mean, a lot of them are very resentful of their theater having completely been invaded by, these Hindustani plays and these Hindu mythological plays. So there's a lot of resentment that's bubbling amongst the Parsis of Bombay about their theater having been invaded, taken over. And so you see the development of, again, a very interesting genre called the Parsi Sansari Natak, the Parsi social drama, in the 1880s, 1890s. And then this goes on, this genre, up until the 1930s, although I don't write about it in the book. And you see how then this genre develops into the Parsi theater as we know it today, Adi Marzban and Dorab Mehta. But this Parsi theater was for the Parsi community of Bombay. So the plays are about Parsi society, and they are fascinating because there are some sort of metaphors in the plays that are just so obvious. I mean, you have this distinction between the innocent damsel from the village and this evil woman from the city. It's a sort of running theme in all of the plays. And there's been a lot of work in theater in the European context that shows how there's a certain valorization of the pastoral during this time. And there's links between that and proto-fascism. So a certain love for the countryside and for the pure populations of the countryside, and how, the seed, the pure seed of a particular community can be found in sort of the bucolic village areas that have been untouched by the ravages of the city and urban society. And so the Parsis begin to essentially, through this genre, create a competing discourse that's separate from this Hindu nationalist discourse that's taking place on the Parsi commercial stage. And so you begin to see quite a significant transition in the Parsi community, in the way the Parsi community is making sense of its position in Indian society, because this genre is very much culturally isolated from both the English as well as Hindustani public sphere and performative media. And so it begins to enunciate a certain competing understanding of Parsi culture and racial identity. And it also thereby reflects aspirations to distinct self and nationhood. So you begin to see lots of references in the press to a Parsi nation, the need to create a Parsi nation. Maybe in Bangalore, I remember that was sort of one option. So there's lots of references, especially I would say not in the 1890s, but in the 1910s and 20s, particularly after the Tata case, the conversion case. And so part two, if I ever get around to writing a part two, we'll talk about this in more explicit terms. I sort of got to the 1890s and I had written 600 pages of my thesis. And that was when my advisor wisely said, you should stop. But I have the material and I know what the narrative is. And it's essentially, you see that in the second part from 1893 to 1930, you see a certain obsession in the Parsi theater with purity and with blood, and also a turn again to Iranian mythological plays, especially in the 1930s, and a certain, I think, desire to come to terms with what the Parsis' position in Indian society should be. Should it be with the Indian nationalist movement, or should it be a distinct Parsi self and nationhood? Maybe in 15, 20 years time, once my second and third book projects are over, I'll be able to return to this and finish the second part that's still, I think, left to be done. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have about the book. So maybe I can start with the questions that are in the chat box. Was this John Wilson the founder of the John Wilson Educational Society? Yes, he was. The Wilson College at Chowpatty is sort of one of the legacies of his work. He did sort of set up some of Bombay's best schools. Parsis used to send their kids by the droves to his schools because that's where their kids could get a very good English education. But of course, they began to regret that once their children began to convert to Christianity. In fact, one of these kids became an actor on the Parsi stage, and his name was Dadi Christ, his pet name, and Christ because he became Christian. Yes, he was the founder of the John Wilson Educational Society. Okay, Farokh, I think.
Yes, in the period that you talk about, Rashna, did women ever go on stage? There was a question that the person presumes that they did not go on stage, but when did they?
No, they did. I mean, this is what the last slide is about. So the book talks about Mary Fenton. I mean, prior to Mary Fenton, there's this very important episode. Dadabhai Sorabji Patel, he is very sort of important in that respect. He was the scion of the Patel family, important Sethia family. He was one of the few people in Bombay to get an MA at the time. And he sort of leaves his sort of posh upbringing behind to sort of join the theater, first with the Iranian Theatrical Company and then with the Victoria. And he introduces two dancing girls on stage and in the Sabha, Lal Pari, all these sort of paris dancing on stage, the fairies. This results in an uproar. I mean, there's a complete sort of hullabaloo in the theater with all these famous Parsis walking out halfway through the performance, and the Parsi press just completely going berserk about, you know, these women performing on stage, because the reform movement, you know, a large part of the reform movement was about sort of distinguishing the Parsi theater from Nach performances and Nach girls, which was base and crude and horrible according to the reformist press. And here you had these Nach girls then on stage now because they were interesting and they would attract patrons to the professional theater. So that was the first time that women were on stage, sometime in the 1870s, I believe 1874. And then subsequently, the first so-called professional actress is Mary Fenton. That's a very interesting story about how she becomes a part of the Parsi theater. She meets Kawasji Khatao while he's on tour. And Jahangir Khambata, allegedly, according to him, was very unhappy with the liaison that they were having because Kawasji Khatao is married. But they have this whirlwind affair and she comes back to Bombay with him. And then there's all of this gossip in the Parsi press about this white woman who is sort of taking away this Parsi man from his respectable family. But slowly, I mean, she's quite smart and she begins to perform these very sort of respectable roles in Hindu mythological plays, but also then in the Parsi social drama. So she has impeccable Gujarati pronunciation. She wears the sari the way sort of an orthodox Parsi woman would. And so progressively she's accepted by Parsi society and the Parsi community. But I mean, she leads a very difficult life. I mean, there's reports of how someone tries to kidnap her while she's in a Fenton in a carriage in Bombay. And eventually she dies quite young, actually. She has an affair with another man, another actor, a friend actually of Kawasji Khatao's. And so, I mean, she led a very interesting life. And then she had her son Jahangir, who then becomes a very important actor manager in the 1920s and 30s, who donates all of these scripts to the Calcutta Parsi Amateur Dramatics Club. So, I mean, but, you know, because of her, I would say actresses begin to become accepted on the Parsi stage. So in the 1890s, you find this very interesting phenomenon where actually women are encouraged to become actresses because, you know, and this is, again, it's fascinating because there's news in the press of how Parsi men are developing these weird fantasies for the boys who are acting as women, homosexuality. In order to prevent that, they need women actresses, female actresses on stage, but the female actresses can't be Parsi. They have to be Hindu or Muslim. So it would be better if they didn't have Parsi theater. If Parsi theater didn't exist, then if Parsi women went on stage. So there's a certain duplicity there in terms of who can be an actress. So
did Mary Fenton ever take on an Indian name, or did she continue her career as Mary Fenton?
I think her whole career, she was Mary Fenton. So, okay. Yeah.
There's a question about...
I mean, she was called Meherbai, sorry, in some plays. Okay. Meherbai, yeah, but Mary Fenton was...
Question from Ramu. He's talking about the 1871 play by Edalji Jamsetji Khori. His question is, how important were the Daftar Akshar publications in terms of popularizing theatre culture in Bombay? And he believes that the stories in Daftar Akshar provided the inspiration for the theatre scene from the 1850s and the 60s.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very observant sort of point. The Daftar Ashkara press was social reformist press. So you see that a lot of the Parsi theatre scripts were published by that press, but they especially take on, I think, a more important role, I would say, in the 1880s and 1890s with the Parsi social drama, because the spectacular theatre, actually the plays didn't widely circulate. It was the Parsi Sansari Natak plays that widely circulated and that could be read. But plays like Sona Na Molni Khurshid are actually very difficult to read. They're not very reader friendly. A lot of sort of the spectacular plays are not reader friendly because the emphasis is on the spectacle. It's on the sort of flying demons and on the water fountain and the lights and the dancing women. Yeah, in that sense, I would say the Daftar Ashkara press is very important, I would say in the later part especially, not so much.
And he wants to know if there were any other gems translated from Persian to Hindustani.
Ooh, lots. There's quite a few, but I wouldn't call them gems again because the Hindustani plays were the commercial ones. So those were the commercial plays. So again, they're quite difficult to read because there's a lot of emphasis on song. They're much thinner. So because again, dialogue is not as important, narrative is not as important, the story is not as important, it's the visual effects that are important. In fact, most of the time, as some of you may know, the Parsi manager was essentially telling the poor Munshi in Hindustani what to write. So this is the plot, you write this, and then that Munshi was just writing it down in a couple of days. So it's not the kind of book that a respectable Parsi woman would be sitting and reading on her veranda in the 19th century. So these Hindustani plays were, I would say, thin in terms of just narrative structure, but very interesting in terms of then if you have to think about what was actually taking place on stage and then linking that to the advertisements that talk about then the spectacular effects that they're going to show. Yeah.
So would it be correct to say that the focus in this period was on social reform rather than entertainment?
Well, up until 1865, yes, it was on social reform. But then from 1865 onwards, it's entertainment. But then, like I said, you have this parallel Parsi social drama thing developing that is odd in its own way in terms of what it's trying to do and the claims it's trying to make for the Parsi community. Yeah.
So in the period that you're referring to, was the Gujarati theatre active? When I say Gujarati, I mean the Shuddha Gujarati theatre, was that active? And were there any linkages between the Parsi theatre and Gujarati theatre? Dara wants to know.
Yeah, so the book talks about how the first how Kabraji collaborates with Ranchor Bhai Udairam on Harish Chandra, which is the first big Hindu mythological play of the Parsi stage. So he essentially takes Ranchhod Bhai Udairam's script and then adapts it for the Parsi stage. But Ranchhod Bhai then he becomes disillusioned with the Parsi theatre, obviously, even though the Parsi theatre then begins to perform Shuddh Gujarati plays, and then he helps set up the Gujarati Natak Mandali. And that's when you begin to see in the late 1870s a certain competition developing between the Parsi theatre, the professional Parsi theatre companies that were better in terms of visual effects, spectacular scenery, just acting talent, and the Hindu companies that were performing, they were better in terms of language. They were performing the Shuddh, pure Gujarati. And then there's these interesting language debates that take place in the 19th century about what is Gujarati, and Parsi Gujarati increasingly becomes delegitimized. And that's also depicted in the Parsi Sansari Natak. So a big theme of the Parsi Sansari Natak is using Parsi Gujarati and not Shuddh Gujarati. It's a way of creating a certain kind of isolated public sphere where Parsi Gujarati, in the same way that Adi Marzban and Dorab Mehta used Parsi Gujarati, was used for the first time in this very self-enclosed space. So, yeah.
Shanaz wants to know, what is Kabraji's full name?
Kekhashru Navroji Kabraji was the head of the editor of the Raskoftar and the head for some time of the Victoria Theatrical Company and the Society for the Amelioration of Drama. But his brother, Bamanji Navroji Kabraji, is also, he becomes a very important playwright. And he writes a lot of these Parsi social dramas. And in fact, one of the things that Bamanji Navroji Kabraji's grandson was telling me is that there was some rivalry between the brothers. So it was very difficult for Bamanji to stage his plays and have his plays performed because senior Kabraji was very imposing. Yeah. Farokh, I think you're muted.
The host doesn't like me.
Okay.
There's a question from Madhuvanti. She says, has the Parsi theatre given any actors to the film industry? That's one part of it. And where are the places where Parsi theatre is still active?
Okay, so absolutely, yes, there's lots of connections between the later Parsi theatre and Bollywood. But again, this is the subject of part 2 of that I will write maybe in 30 years' time, where I talk about essentially how the big commercial Parsi theatre gives way to Bollywood. If we think about Sohrab Modi or any of these people, that legacy is very much from the Parsi theatre. Prithviraj Kapoor's acting, all of that comes from there. Where are the places that Parsi theatre is still active? It depends what kind of Parsi theatre we're talking about. If we're talking about the legacy of the Parsi social drama, Bombay, Calcutta, these are the places where you can still every Navroz see your Parsi theatre play. And this is one of the, I think, what's interesting is that Adi Marzban's father, Feroz Shah Marzban, Pijam, he was a very important playwright of the Parsi social drama in the 1930s and 1920s, a conservative editor of the Jam-e Jamshed. And he, his son essentially, Adi, takes on that mantle and then makes the theatre something very different in the 1950s. And, that would be a third book, which is about how the Parsi theatre post-independence is essentially was a way for the Parsi community to grapple with a certain loss of self-esteem, a certain disillusionment, and a failed nation state, essentially. All of those aspirations that the father had for a Parsi nation, for a separate Parsi national identity, essentially, the later Parsi theatre of the 1960s and 70s is trying to come to terms with that. And there's a certain sense of emasculation also that I find really interesting in the later Parsi theatre. So the female characters are very strong, as we know, in Dorab Mehta and Adi Marzban's plays, and they're, essentially rebuking the emasculated, weak Parsi man. I would say that is one place. And then the commercial Parsi theatre, you can see remnants of it in the Nurti tradition, in sort of southern states. You can see it in Bangsawan, in sort of East Asia and Southeast Asia, and so there are these remnants that are still there everywhere. But these are, I think, subjects for other PhD students to write about. So,
but you already seem to have done your background research, or at least begun to. So, can we look forward to a book sooner than 20 years?
Oh, I don't know, because now I'm sort of knee deep in other stuff.
All right.
Other stuff related to development in India, so the 1960s and 70s, and how culture begins to assume a central role in development in the Indian subcontinent with the Ford and Rockefeller foundations. So I think once I sort of finish that, maybe eventually, yeah.
All right. We've come to the end of the questions, Rashna. Thank you so much for your time. And I know it's early morning for you, so thank you for doing this for us. Thank you, audience, for attending.
Being here. Yeah.
Thank you, audience. Thank you so much for your time. Do attend. Thank you again, Rashna. Bye.